It's called Me, She, He, They, Reality versus Identity in the 21st Century. It's a very long piece. I'm not going to read anything close to all of it, but the part that I want to read goes over some of the ground that we just went over. Sex is real and ubiquitous. Sex in this usage is shorthand for sexual reproduction, which is the raison d'etre for there being distinct sexes. In our lineage, sexual reproduction has an uninterrupted history of at least 500 million years. It may well be closer to 2 billion years. Furthermore, sex is binary, at least among all plants and animals. Sex is not at its most fundamental about chromosomes or hormones, about breasts or facial hair, about behavior or fashion. Sex at its most fundamental is about DNA from multiple individuals being brought together to create a zygote. But DNA isn't sufficient for a new life. You also need cellular machinery like mitochondria and ribosomes. Without the cellular machinery, the cytoplasm, no zygote will be formed. Cellular machinery is big, though, compared to DNA. Someone's got to bring it if sex is going to work. So some sex cells, gametes, are big because they contain the requisite cellular machinery. Those big gametes are eggs. That's one of the two large problems posed by reproducing sexually, from whence to source the cellular machinery. The other is how to find a partner. Trade-offs being what they are, big cells are slower than small cells. Eggs being big for cells, they therefore also tend to be slow or entirely sessile. So it falls to the other type of gamete to move around its environment looking for eggs. This other type of gamete is largely devoid of cellular machinery. It's called pollen in plants, sperm in animals. Eggs are large and cytoplasm rich and sessile. Sperm are small and stripped down and fast. Two types of gametes, two sexes. In much of life on Earth, in nearly all plants and animals, and in absolutely all mammals, which includes humans, sex is real and ubiquitous. In his masterful compilation and analysis of the anthropological literature, Donald Brown writes that all cultures, quote, have a sex terminology that is fundamentally dualistic, even when it comprises 3 or 4 categories. When there are 3, one is a combination of the 2 basic sexes, for instance, a hermaphrodite, or one is a crossover sex, a man acting as a woman. When there are 4, there are then 2 normal sexes and 2 crossover sexes. That's all a quote from Brown's work. Brown's crossover sex is now referred to as the umbrella term trans. Trans has emerged in many cultures, but it has never been common, not nearly so common as homosexuality, for instance. And Brown's hermaphrodites have more recently been called intersex, who are now often referred to as having a disorder of sexual development, a DSD, although here we begin to run into problems. The distinction between people with DSDs and trans people is sometimes hard to parse, the boundaries between them sometimes fuzzy. Some people who actually have DSDs may never have them diagnosed and may live as trans people, thus belonging in both categories. Both categories are indeed real and, in contrast to sex itself, very, very rare. In a few places, Western science has discovered a mechanism which explains a relatively high rate of unusual sexual presentation. In the village of Las Salinas in the Dominican Republic, for instance, some number of people are understood to be machi-hembras, which means basically male-female. Intersex, in fact, but presenting as female through childhood until puberty transforms them into decidedly more male in appearance. The molecular explanation for this particular DSD is, in part, that mutations in the 5-alpha reductase type 2 gene, which is autosomal, not on a sex chromosome, affect the steroid 5-alpha reductase 2 isoenzyme, which in turn causes a dihydrotestosterone deficiency, which in turn inhibits development of male typical characteristics such as external genitalia. We should all be grateful for the scientists who are driven to discover molecular pathways like the one above, but for most of us, the human side of the story is more compelling. In Las Salinas, Felicita was a little girl who enjoyed going to birthday parties with her sister until, as she approached puberty, she came to prefer playing with boys. During adolescence, as her sister's body became rounded and fuller, Felicita's shoulders broadened and she grew strong and tall. Like most children with 5-alpha reductase deficiency, she had looked like and been raised as a girl until puberty revealed that for her, the truth was more complicated. Felicita was a machi-hembra. Las Salinas is not the only place on Earth in which a DSD has come to be explained by scientists, a DSD which explains in retrospect the relatively high number of people in those communities who transition from female to male during puberty. Las Salinas is not unique, but it, like DSDs and transness more generally, is very rare. Those individuals, 4 more paragraphs, those individuals who can or will or have or might make eggs are female. Those individuals who can or will or have or might make sperm or pollen are male. This is a true binary, which DSDs make more difficult to parse, but DSDs are the extreme exception. They are indeed disorders. Sex is not assigned at birth. Sex is observed at birth. A baby born with ambiguous genitalia or an undiagnosed DSD may be observed to be the sex that they are not, and that observation is therefore an error. Development is complicated, but the fact of anisogamy, 2 different types of gametes, not 3 or 5 or 13, but 2, which come together to create a new life, is true. Furthermore, development being complicated means that sometimes some of the manifestations of your sex will be out of sync with your actual sex. Hence the idea of being, quote, born in the wrong body. Again, sex is not at its most fundamental about chromosomes or hormones, about breasts or facial hair, about behavior or fashion. But if your sex chromosomes determined your sex accurately with regard to gamete type and primary sex characteristics, but ran into some hiccups as your brain was being formed or as your secondary sex characteristics were developing, you might well feel, as some do, very much at odds with the body you are in. Of course, you might also feel that way during adolescence regardless. The vast majority of people who feel uncomfortable in their own bodies as those bodies transform from child to adult are not trans. Let me be clear. We are dealing with the interface between long-standing products of evolution, subtle matters of humanity which have blurry borders, and a brave new world of technological modifications that has yet to stand any test of time. That leaves all of us, even those who are thoroughly versed in the facts and logic of sex and sexuality, grappling with new and genuinely difficult questions. No one has yet worked out the solutions that best resolve all of the tensions. And I
Perfect.
For a while.
Yeah, no, I would say perfectly explored, every word of it.
Steve Herman, another great. He was an ornithologist at Evergreen, who I was actually nominally hired to replace, as happens in many academic positions. And if you want to show my screen here, Zach, he wrote the year that I was hired. Actually, this is a 2002 paper. He wrote this invited paper for the Journal of Wildlife Management, which is funny because, as you will see from the quote I'm going to share, he was not into management. And this is called Wildlife Biology and Natural History, Time for a Reunion. And in this, among other things, he defends natural history collections, and he built, basically with, who was the botanist whom we never met at Evergreen, but he and his colleague at Evergreen, who was the botanist, built the collections at Evergreen, of which I was a curator for many years. And they were small, but they were mighty. They were actually they were a lot better than our library was, right? Mm-hmm. And, Steve was careful and rigorous, and he held no truck with fools or with hubris. And this is not exactly on topic with regard to the value of natural history museums, but I've just screenshotted a bit from far down in this paper, which I'll link the paper in the show notes. Here we have Steve Herman on the, before I go here, I'll say that Steve Herman retired not too long after I showed up in 2002, again, because it was sort of I was being hired into his position-ish. And unfortunately, he died in 2020, and we talked about him a bit in that first wave of COVID, although he had been sick and he was old, but the world no longer has him. So here is Steve Herman on the disconnect between management and natural history. Managers have to manage. I have always been very selective about asking local resource managers to talk to my classes on field trips. At best, this can be a useful way to introduce students to the wildlife field and to familiarize them with local problems and solutions. At worst, one risks letting some proselytizer natter on forever about his or her favorite weed problem and how he or she is going to solve it with pesticides, or how the unit is starved for personnel and funding, etc. In the absence of careful preparation, students mistake uniforms and assertiveness for authority and science. My favorite sentence in here. Another reason I resist these encounters is that it is a lazy way to teach. Wildlife programs commonly use this technique. The professor gets a free pass, and the refuge manager, for example, gets a free audience of young, impressionable students who want eventually to work in a similar role. The status quo is served and strengthened. And wildlife programs are places where training often substitutes for education. So this fits perfectly with our analysis of what the value of natural history museums is, both museums of zoology and herbaria, and also the value of field work itself. Field work is far noisier than lab work. And there are questions that you can't ask in the field, just as there are questions that you can't ask in the lab. Field scientists and lab scientists will tend to have different personalities. There's a sorting thing that happens. And mostly those of us who have done most of our work in the field would not be well suited to a life in the lab, and vice versa. Although lab scientists like to imagine that field scientists are just on vacation all the time, which, of course, if that were true, why didn't you choose that yourself? And I think it is in part a the rise of not just the bean counters, but also of the reductionist, tech-heavy, need to get more grants type of science that looks at things like natural history collections and says, what value is that? What do we need that for? Isn't that old school? Aren't we done looking at actual organisms? Aren't we better than that? Don't we use tools to either go really, really small or really, really big, or really, really close or really, really far away? Isn't the human scale of sensory understanding of the universe really passé? No, it's not. And it's still the best way that we have to understand most things that do exist at our scales. And we are risking getting rid of not just a tradition that has been very important to human understanding, but specimens that may actually, and here I'll go practical for a moment, but may end up having in them some of the things that will answer questions like, how do I treat this disease? And I don't want to defend herbaria on the basis of actually within your 825,000 plant species, you may have in there somewhere a molecule that could be the cure for something that people have been trying to cure for a long time. But that's also true. And it's as if no one has thought of this.
Yeah, and I have the sad sense, as I did when Michigan shipped its collections off to the hinterlands, that at the point that you have to make these arguments out loud, it's clear that something fundamental has been lost from the discussion, right? At the point that you have to defend natural history and collections and library access and all of these things, it's like its own, it's like sophistry that doesn't have to speak, right? What is the value of that collection? Oh my God, how could I, if you're asking that question, you probably don't have the capacity to understand the answer.